Everyone. So in this session, we're going to tackle chapter 7, the ecology of freedom, which I didn't do a word count, but it strikes me as one of the shorter, if not the shortest chapter in the book. And so I welcome a short chapter this time of year, especially in a book that has many chapters that even the shortest are packed with lots of insights and stuff to chew on. So this chapter I really appreciated because it is so to me straightforward in its argument. The title, of course, Ecology of Freedom, is a direct reference to Murray Bookchin's work, his pioneering work in social ecology, which the authors reference, though they're using it in a different term, in a different way, and they're quite explicit in the footnotes in distinguishing how they are both inspired by his work, but also are revisiting some of the arguments that he made about prehistorical society that they're able to add some complexity to, and that's where they deviate, is in some of the conclusions that they ultimately reach. But where they're similar is that the Davids and Bookchin both agree that human engagement with the biosphere really turns on the sorts of social arrangements, systems of social organization that people have in place. And so as much as the biosphere, one's engagement with the biosphere will of course shape one's social arrangements, it's not an a priori determination, that social arrangements really determine the way that people engage with the biosphere. And that kind of premise has been lost in a lot of the scholarship that has taken some of the arguments of prehistory and archaeology to then link it to this ultimately teleological argument about how, given the complexity of human society today, that we need the sort of hierarchy and unequal distribution that we have. And so they're peeling away at that larger conventional wisdom, which of course requires them going back in time to when agriculture was new on the earth for human societies. And it wasn't this simple story of discovering agriculture and the revolution then follows. And as Rousseau would have it, we then become trapped in chains of our own making. And so they start with the idea that there was no single agricultural revolution, that to really put it in that capital A, capital R kind of usage is playing into the idea that it was a singular event, and that the archaeological record for some time now has suggested otherwise, and that this might be well known among archaeologists. I'm not sure, but if it is, it's not a kind of argument that's reaching into, I think, larger discourses about, the big theory history, like Jared Diamond. And so what they show is the adoption, abandonment, readoption of agriculture, and that it wasn't a simple diffusionist model, that once agriculture started, that people maintained that relationship forever. And so their idea of ecology of freedom is precisely the freedom to come into agriculture and then leave it. And so that kind of third freedom the third element of freedom, the ability to abandon, to walk away, is something that for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years in human development, existed. And so they use a couple examples, the Nile Valley and Amazonia, to make their case, to show that farming typically started as an economy of deprivation. That yes, we can find evidence of it in areas, in effluvial plains where there's great mineral resource, but that more often than not, farming was a result of adopting that practice only after other practices weren't available, only when other better options weren't available. And so agriculture ended up starting in areas where resources were often the thinnest rather than the richest. And that's basically how they conclude the chapter. And they give a hint that the next chapter is going to show that that there were then cities that relied on agriculture, but that agriculture was not the defining characteristic of those cities, and that you could have agriculture in the absence of stratification, and then you could have cities in the absence of the sort of stratifications that scholars have come to equate with urbanization. So the argument here is really, I think, we're at the heart of the argument of the overall book, because they're now relying on archaeological evidence to show that there wasn't a linear process, a simple linear process of agricultural revolution, but it really started in a series of fits and starts over long periods of time. And the map in particular that they show on page 252 of the independent crop and animal domestication centers provides a nice overview of how agriculture happened across the planet, and not just simply in one place of the Fertile Crescent, and that there were lots of agricultural revolutions and no single simplistic process. So I'd love to hear from others, especially if anyone has archaeological background, which I do not. So their argument to me is, I mean, I take at face value that Wengrow, as an archaeologist, is synthesizing a lot of arguments that specialists within the field have already been aware of, but that general readership has perhaps not heard about. And it certainly isn't the sort of evidence that's in conventional textbooks, history textbooks, at least, like ancient civilization texts. So I'd love to hear from anyone who has thoughts or questions or comments. Nika.
So I don't have an archaeological background, obviously, and I can't comment on that. So if anyone want to comment on archaeological part, they're welcome. If not, I will just talk that for me it was interesting to read this chapter about women and agriculture and gardening. And that's kind of direct reference to Silvia Frederici and to the woman knowledge production, and how a woman was producing this knowledge of dealing with the crops in general and plants and wild plants, and using them for different ways also for medicine and for kind of different ways. So it's I don't really understand how would you call it domestication or not, when you just go out into nature and figure out how everything works and how our body can benefit, humans can benefit, so adjust to whatever is out there, like plants. So it was very feminist trope in this chapter that I liked.
Yeah, I like how they make that link direct, the association between domestication and domestic care. And I also love how they show that domestication itself isn't a singular process, and that too can happen in myriad ways, depending on the social arrangements that are in place. Yeah, it's a real fascinating way of thinking about, of starting from imagination, because then, you know, that the authors really allow us to imagine the range of possibilities, of social and cultural possibilities that existed, because we're not, they don't succumb to infantilizing the subjects that they're writing about, even though the subjects never really take, you know, they never have names. But I feel like at any moment, like, you know, carnival's possible for them, and that, you know, with a seasonal change, that they're free to experiment in these ways that I almost, when I read it, I can almost hear David kind of urging people, you know, go on, try it. You know, you can actually walk away from things and experiment. It might only be for 20 minutes, but these are the sorts of reminders that this book is trying to chart over a 100,000-year time span.
Yeah, and in this case, maybe the reference to the Mary Bookchin and Ecology of Freedom is also like, what is agriculture now is this monocrops and, you know, industrial production, and then what the woman did, that was very kind of, you know, particular connection to each individual plants, and each individual plants would be used for specific purpose, sometimes for food, sometimes for, you know, getting rid of the babies, sometimes for something else. So it's a different idea of how you relate. And I wonder if it's called domestication or not. Is it like this? It's not even gardening. What is that? When you, how do you call it in English? When you go into the nature and you know, like you just knowledge how to use the environment around you. This is not domestication. Huh? What is domestication actually? How you define domestication as you produce certain crops over the many years that is very efficient. And if you go out in the forest and just specifically pick up something that is good for you once when you're sick, let's say, or when you want to have certain strength. It's not domestication, is it?
No, domestication is when a plant or an animal cannot anymore survive without humans.
Is the word you're looking for more like exploitation? Although that has a negative resonance?
It's a negative.
Domestication also negative, is it or not?
Not necessarily. Ellen had a raised hand.
Okay, just to leap into this, I think the question about domestication is really important. I think a definition of it is the one Simona provided, but there's obviously a really long path between foraging and reaching the point where flora and fauna become dependent on humans to replicate. So one of the things that I think hasn't come through in some of the popularizations that we look at is this huge area between those 2 points. And so one of the things, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm an anthropologist who's been in joint departments, so I pick up some of this, but from that point of view, it seems there's certainly specialist knowledge in that area, but I think that we haven't given enough attention to all of that history and contemporary practice that uses and engages with gardening in various descriptions that isn't agriculture. And there's a huge realm of that, which is what they're bringing the attention to focus on. So that if we look at things that are more historical, we tend to call it horticulture that isn't so completely controlling. And that's been alive and well right into the modern world. And it's interesting in a way that the stories that we've had of human history have sort of ignored the fact that agriculture isn't the only, in terms of this rigid domestication and intensive cultivation, isn't the only thing that's ever been going on. So there's, in that popular history, this has been missed out, although it's abundantly obvious right into the contemporary world. So what, in a sense, is being opened up in this book is a whole range of different kinds of interaction with the natural world that somehow didn't get into some of the unilinear stories we tell ourselves. It wasn't going directly from foraging to intensive agriculture. It was something else. And I think it also, I stand to be corrected perhaps by archaeologists, but as I've encountered it, there's generally the thought that there were a number of separate points at which agriculture emerged. And it would only make sense to think there were many points at which there were horticulture. But there isn't an argument that, as I understand that most people would take, that everything came from one breakthrough. I think that isn't the case, but it was that there were a number of them that then did become diffused. But that could be might require some further investigation of what people think happened with diffusion. And the last word on that really is that if you look at the ethnohistorical and ethnographic discussions of horticultural societies, there's really a very strong connection with women's knowledge of plants, and also with a very different modes of social organization that are less patriarchal. That's again not one scheme that fits every single society. There's all kinds of choice and variation, but there's a tendency in that direction. That's it for me.
Stephen, would you like to jump in?
Sure. I think that's what's so interesting about the use of the phrase play farming, and I find it a bit strange because it doesn't quite sound, it sounds a bit clunky, but the way I was taking it was activities which go beyond foraging, in the sense that you're actively shaping and sort of, changing how plants grow and behave and changing the environment, but in a way that isn't domestication. Is this sort of like in between space between foraging and domestic agriculture. And maybe that's why it's been so hard to sort of pin pin down or deceive, because it's this sort of in between liminal activity that doesn't fit into two categories, and can go back and forth between them.
I just jump in. I thought it was quite interesting to see that the careful footnote on social ecology, that they're very much the premise of social ecology that people's relationship to the environment deals with their social relations, but not so much they sort of didn't agree with the actual details. So it would be interesting to see if in the future some people who are kind of within that social ecology movement will engage with that and try to rewrite some of the early history. The thing that I thought was interesting was, because this chapter blends in really well, quite a lot with the previous one, which was the Gardens of Adonis, and looks very much at the sort of gender relations of the thing. But this very short chapter on ecology of freedom, it seems to be engaging with just to bust the idea of the agricultural revolution, which was and so looking at this chapter as a little bit of I mean, for archaeologists, this may be a nerdy argument about details, but I think we wouldn't have to know that much about the archaeology to kind of say, well, if you can give clear examples of why the agricultural revolution as it is conceived in general doesn't work, then you've successfully broken a myth down. And I think that is maybe what this whole book does. It's kind of unpicks a myth that we have in our culture now about modernization, that there was an agricultural revolution and then an industrial revolution and now an information age revolution, that type of step function. I just flagged what might be relevant for this chapter on page 213, which is back in the Gardens of Adonis. It has this guy's name, Gordon Child, who invented the word agricultural revolution in the 30s and 40s. So that's this period of time where you're really seeing this bursting on the scene of all the technological powers. Those are the times when you have a modernist movement or a futurist movement. These types of declarations in Europe were right at a time when huge the militarism created huge mechanical innovations. And so you have those types of reestablishing how people think about the world. And that maybe is, if you kind of see this as a lot of the book is undoing Rousseau, you could also, somebody could take this chapter and use it and compare the archaeological evidence to this early history in the 1930s and 40s of modernism, and where we invent this myth of the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and now people go the information age revolution. And I think that would make a nice addition to this genre, like a future book out of a genre that comes out of this type of thing.
Yeah, and if you think about it, those conceptual constructions of revolution, the industrial, the agricultural, the industrial, and the information, those get preserved and documented because they're forms of commerce. And so what they're really documenting is the sorts of exploitative exchanges or transactions that happen among state leaders in many cases, or entrepreneurs and state authorities. But the authors seem to be making this, well, they've made it elsewhere in some of the articles that preceded the book, that if one falls into the trap of using monuments, agricultural records as proxies for civilization, then you're really just writing a history of the state and of commerce, but state coerced commerce. And it really poses a problem for the kind of approach that they're taking, because if they are looking at foragers or populations that relied on horticulture rather than agriculture, then it's not going to leave that documentary basis. And so I think that kind of emphasis on the commercial aspect was not only a function of the evidence, but I think it was also a function of what people thought of as legitimate kinds of evidence that I think science is now able to offer some tools and technologies that allow for reconstruction of other evidences that are going to make for what I hope is a broader kind of sense of these many agricultural revolutions rather than a singular one.
Simona wants to say something.
Oh, Simona, yes.
If I can unmute me. Yes, good evening. I think the very point of this chapter, and even of the chapter 6, is the difference between serious agriculture, culture, and play. And the point is proving that serious agriculture is not a destiny of humanity, is not the only possibility at hand. And there is actually a bias in our knowledge about the other possibilities that run alongside that of agriculture. But the bias is that we have much more evidence for civilization based on agriculture, because it's a Eurasian civilization. We know what happened in Eurasia and Oceania and Africa because they were strictly interconnected before the discovering of Americas, while Americas stayed separate and developed other possibilities. And I think this is the reason why this book is so focused on American indigenous people rather than on Africa and Mesopotamia. And when they talk about Eurasia, it's to confront Eurasian solutions against America's solution. What's important in this difference between serious commitment and playful commitment is that in the playful one, you have a plurality of solutions to the human needs. And play is a strong word because they want to stress the not serious commitment of it. But what's important, in my opinion, is that is the opposition to serious commitment. The first people that seriously committed to agriculture did so in environment left over by forage hunters. it was a marginal solution to our food problem. And actually, the most wise idea would be not to commit too seriously to agriculture. The most wise idea, the wiser idea is to have a multiplicity of solutions, and when one fails, you have the others. This appears to be what happened in Americas, and it also appears to have been a war. The conscious refusal of agriculture in North American indigenous population appears to be the result of something that happened in, I don't remember the name, well, I don't remember, in Central
Cahokia.
Cahokia, thank you. So the idea of conscious refusal of a serious commitment to agriculture is important there, but also the fact that in most cases in Americas, people choose not to commit too seriously to agriculture. I hope I was not so too confused. Okay.
Hi, I just want to make a comment, add on to what we've all been saying, is that another way that I've understood play farming was not only was it an experimentation and a refusal to commit to one thing, but it had to happen in a time when it wasn't like a matter of life and death, when there was the room and the space and the other resources available that have allowed for this kind of playful experimentation. So it's not simply like not taking it seriously, but not having to take it seriously. And I also want to say this comment about serious committed agriculture versus play farming with benefits is brilliant. Right. So I just wanted to add that to the topic of play farming. So yeah, the fact that there was, not necessarily an abundance, but options, and and this does not need to commit to brutal toil for 40, 50, 60 hours a week is a condition for the experimentation and the playfulness and other forms of social experimentation that would follow from that. And it seems like, and yeah, and it's funny because just before this I didn't finish it, but I was just reading David Graeber's other article about play or fun from Bachelor a while back, and I was hoping to finish that in time, but it's some interesting connections there.
Yeah, Stephen?
One thing I was surprised by it not showing up, and I'm going to struggle to remember the exact details, but I seem to remember in James Scott's book, The Art of Not Being Governed, which I think appears about 200 pages after this, there's some discussion about walking away from agriculture, walking away from certain forms of agriculture, particularly those that were easier to sort of track, regulate, or inspect. So for instance, like why certain places there would be a preference for root vegetables as opposed to rice, because rice, you can't hide rice, right? Because it's really obvious, visible. It's totally easy to regulate, while a root vegetable can be grown and left and come back to. So I'm just thinking out loud here, if there's a connection between different particular forms of crops grown that in that James Scott argument, and how that might overlap here, or whether that's something totally separate. I'm not sure because I haven't read that book in a few years. Does anybody remember?
Yeah, so he does, and Jim Scott's got sort of a big take on the specificity of crop cultivation based on being able to hide you know, the ease of obscuring what's being grown. And so, yeah, in highland areas where there's a lot of terraced farming, that requires a level of labor input and that I don't know if play farming would really accommodate itself to, you know, to terrace farming, probably not. And so, you know, Scott uses it to make this larger argument where topography also matters, because as one goes higher up in elevation, one is escaping state authority, and that's sort of, you know, this universal premise that Scott uses. And then he makes similar argument in Against the Grain, where the evidence he presents shows that in many cases the first forms of agriculture were the result of enslaved labor, and that it was not a good option in most cases. And so the two Davids are building upon Scott's work, I think very, very nicely. Scott's one of the few to have the kind of historical and geological, or geographical rather, range that David Graeber does. So it's nice to see two brilliant minds tackle some similar questions.
Well, I also remember that David had talked in 2005. David had talked with James about doing a project together, which never happened for obvious reasons. But so I wouldn't be surprised if some of the conversations they had then sort of then filtered through to this 15 years later.
Yeah, I didn't know that they had talked about collaborating. That has me really curious. I might ask, I don't know if Vasily would know the answer to that, or Nika perhaps. That would have been fascinating. Yeah, why are there so few anarchists in the academy? Yep, maybe that's the question they would have asked. Yeah, Nika.
Or maybe it's Nikki first.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, sure.
I don't have a theory about this, but more like an intuition that I can imagine that when people were experimenting, that it also could be like a sacred science or a sacred duty. So that's why they don't want to expand it or to make it a dominant thing, but it's really like a sacred thing. So they keep it small.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case, and the, you know, the overlap among science, religion, and magic, you know, is something that since the Enlightenment, I think Western society's gotten wrong, or just separated them and gone about their business. Let's see, there was Nika, were you going to then say something?
It was somebody else that I didn't want to. No. Yeah. Okay. So actually, my question is, can we explore the difference between play and culture? Because agriculture seems like this word is kind of constitutes something like very rigid framework in which we are by definition already not free. Yeah, I don't know if anybody want to say something about that. I think Simona, when she started to talk about, yeah, that's when I wanted to comment on Simona's trend.
I'm supposed to answer now. No. I think I don't know if I told you I'm trying to to examine the evolution of concepts and terms in David Graeber's thought. And I think that play is one of the key words that are worth being examined. And one element is that of what's the point of we can't have fun, which is the one that Michael is reading, I guess, in Buffer. And another is the last chapter of the Utopia of Rules, where it's opposed to games. I'm not sure agriculture is in as much it's a culture opposed to play. Culture can be a creative thing and mobile thing, and it has all possibilities inside it. Maybe the difference is between being constrained in one solution when you start depending on sewing and on agriculture, you are stuck in this.
But isn't it also connected to the colonialism? It's like said that, okay, so this particular type of civilization invented agriculture, and then, you know, they invented like something else, and that's how they took over the world. And in this case, word culture is like, you know, a stuff for quality and also for unavoidable dominance. And the play is the kind of things that, you know, people do that sometimes, but it's not really essential.
Yeah. Speaking, but maybe Mary and Mark should jump in. So I'll comment after them, because I have an idea. Mark, you are muted, or maybe it was Mary first.
Mary would go.
Okay. I just wanted to say that I think the narrative of the evolution of production, you know, from hunter-gatherers to agriculture to industrial revolution to the information revolution, all of this has been used essentially to justify empires, as we know, and it was pretty much used all along towards justifying the British Empire. You know, we're bringing civilization to these uncivilized people, which is why they had such complex rituals and etc. etc. Whereas the idea of play sounds to me to be much more friendly towards towards the American empire, the ruling empire that we have now, which is more of a, you know, it focuses on freedom and we're just liberating these people and they're free to do everything they want so long as it's convenient to us. That's sort of how it seems to go. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because I think there's a danger that we take what the Davids are saying around play and freedom and we turn it into something that is very much individualized. What they would probably say is that these play and this freedom to choose would apply to the collective as well, which is something that goes against the official mainstream narrative. This idea of societies or groups or even nation state experimenting with their own economies or their own agriculture, whatever it happens to be, that is not allowed in the current framework. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that in case, just to bring it into that context.
So now I have three very disparate points. One was just what you were saying, Mary. It's sort of like the difference of anarchist play versus libertarian play. libertarian as we understand it in the United States. It's not the European. But I agree, that's dangerous stuff. The other point I had was Nikki, Mary, and Tanya were talking about the spirituality of the cultivators. And I really appreciated that perspective because it's where you're listening to nature as opposed to telling nature what to do. And when Nikki was saying you're not going to make that a dominant force, say agriculture is the way to go, because you're actually listening to nature in a much different way in the spiritual traditions, I think. My last disparate point was, I don't know if anybody else had this feeling about the mystery of the linear pottery tradition. Whatever happened there 5,000 years ago was very, to me, still a mystery, even with somewhat explanations in the background. But when Michael and Stephen were talking about play as experimentation, it seems to me that that was an experimentation with cost. That is, something else happened there. And they were suggesting that it might have been, some things like maybe they didn't bring enough kinds of cereal. Maybe they didn't bring enough kinds of pulse or something like that to that area. And then you had established foragers on the circumference. And what happened, we don't know, but it was a failure of some kind. And it seems to me that the freedom, the theme of ecology of freedom is suggesting that we need to be able to experiment without those sorts of costs. Anyway, that's still a mystery to me, that part. And sometimes I think they leave little exercises for the reader to think about.
Michael, would you like to go?
Sure, yeah. Another point, playing around the concept of play, that in most in class-based societies, and especially in contemporary capitalism with this emphasis on wage labor, there's a very necessary ideology that kind of convinces that work and play must be completely separate spheres. And in other words, like, you literally have to work just so you're allowed to play a little in your evenings and weekends or something like that. And I think what's been happening in this book and showing us these alternative ways of organizing society is that this doesn't have to be the case, that work in terms of in terms of working to reproduce yourself, your community, family, community, society, can also be pleasurable, can also be experimental, and there doesn't have to be the strict division between mindless wage labor toil and the little bit of leisure that you get afforded after it. And it's been quite important to in order to maintain the status quo of our society, that we do think in terms of there's this massive divide between labor and leisure, work and play, and one we have to do one in order to get a bit of the other. And what's the alternatives that are being presented in this book are incredibly encouraging in this regard, especially if you really hate your job, for example. I mean, not everyone does wage labor. Some people do. A lot of people do have really, really fulfilling, valuable, interesting, fun work. But in most of our societies, there's a lot of people need to have the really, really thankless wage labor just to keep it all going, and on top of that, so that another small class can just simply enjoy all the play.
And then they don't even play.
No, they're miserable.
They have so much money, so much wealth, that they don't even know what to do with it. Like, they don't know how to play anymore.
More. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. May I? I think there is a connection between fear, and the refusal of play. Do you remember the tale of the grasshopper and the ant? It's fascinating that in Sikh tradition there is a totally different tale about it. but in our tradition, we are dominated by the fear of starvation, and you are not serious if you don't, if you are not afraid to starve, and if you spend your summer singing and playing. What happened when Europeans invaded Americas is that population that reproduced a lot. Indigenous Americans were able to keep their freedom because they kept population at a low level. There was plenty of space because there were not too many people, while Europeans tend to accumulate population and goods. And I think there's a two things are related, and both are about fear, about the 7 major cows and the 7 fat cows. And so maybe the main difference between Eurasian European culture, I don't know about Asia, and Americas is fear at the end of the day. And the opposition is between fear and play. And Calvinism is a successful removal of play, of everything that is useless from life. And useful means useful in order to avoid starvation.
Those are hard words to follow. I mean, it's right there. And then Monica with the quote, thank you for sharing that from Utopia of Rules, that what ultimately lies behind the appeal of bureaucracy is fear of play. Yeah. I do want to be mindful of the time. It's 3:59 New York time. So is there anyone, let's say I do see a couple hands up, Michael and Mark. Michael, would you like to add something?
Just that, I guess when we talk about, I didn't really get Nika's thing about culture versus play until I realized that the origin of the word culture is culturing the soil. And it's quite funny that our modern conception of culture is rooted only in the last couple of 100 years. And so it roots back to agriculture. It does point to this book, The Dawn of Everything, is going back such vast periods of time that nothing in it is really relevant to today in any direct sense, other than the lesson, which seems to be their continual lesson, which is undoing a mythology of this was the origin of society and these are the rules. Actually, the rules were quite broad open for many zillions of years. Like my own relation to agriculture, you know, I suppose I have family farming in a background and all that, but like most of us, we go down to the grocery store and we get food, and even the agriculture we're talking about right now in this book by David Graeber is not even the agriculture of the last couple of 100 years. And the agriculture of the last 100 years is actually completely different from the agriculture before that. It's when modernization takes place, and our agriculture today is completely supported by fossil fuels. And in fact, one of the most progressive political movements that's the largest movement is Via Campesina, which would argue that if we see industrial collapse, it is people, the same type of people who could have built those little steps up the Andes and grow a huge amount of food. It involves a huge amount of labor, but that's what would keep a huge amount of people alive today. The alternative would be to give women their own power over their own sexual freedom and stop the drive for reproduction and make sexuality play rather than reproductive. And then you might see population voluntarily diminish rather than continually grow. But I don't really know what those kind of dynamics would look like. But we are in this case of we have been doing a giant experiment with agriculture and then for a couple hundred years and agriculture and fossil fuels now, and the fossil fuels are running out. And there's a larger amount of people than have ever been on the world. So the idea of going back to foraging and hunter-gathering things sounds enticing, except that it really looks more like a Mad Max movie in that sense. So like I'd rather kind of talk our global leaders down off the ledge and, to bring them back to what is a viable solution. But this kind of, so that's maybe one other piece of the puzzle for agriculture today versus agriculture back in these times, innumerable times in innumerable places that it's being discussed.
Nika?
Yeah, I just want to quickly comment that it's many other ways to grow food except of hunter-gatherers. Foraging is like when you pick up the food, yeah? So we were growing spirulina with David. So that's very, you do it in a jar in the apartments in the city. So it's playful. So I think it's many other ways of how you feed yourself. It's just a question of social arrangements and individual people allowed to be thinking differently. Also, I want to say that in Soviet Union, when it's collapsed, and suddenly all these vast, big industrial cities were deprived from grocery shopping and distribution of food was interrupted. Then the people went to their small daches, the tiny piece of land that they had, and they started to grow gardening. And then it's in amazing numbers that 70% of the grocery or the food was produced in this tiny piece of land, In Russia, where it's actually it's not Ukraine, it's not Italy, it's very difficult to grow anything, it's not Cuba, but it feed themselves. So it's kind of like we have many options.
Cuba had to do actually the same thing, didn't? When the Soviet Union collapsed, they had absolutely nothing, and so they went straight into the gardens and grew food everywhere, plant pots, and anywhere where they could grow anything. I mean, obviously they had nicer climate, but must have been challenging as well. So there are ways, there are always options. The question is, do we have the political freedom or political will?
All right, I think that's a good place to wrap up. So thank you. I don't know when our next one is. I guess it's in 2 weeks, but will it be a Monday or a Thursday? I don't know.
Thursday.
Thursday, okay. Thursday is better for me overall, so that's fine. Okay, so we'll do chapter 8, which is the imaginary cities, where we'll get to sink into urban development in Mesoamerica, town of Teotihuacan. So wait for the excitement. It's good seeing everyone. And
on the January the 6th.
Is that it? January the 6th?
Yes, that is the Befana in Italy.
Oh.
It's a very important festivity.
Will we see you, Simona? Okay.
Totally.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Have a good
Bye, thank you.
holidays.